Real stories. Extreme survival. No fiction. Welcome to Stories by Candlelight.
In the winter of 1846, nearly 90 American pioneers became trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains. By spring, almost half of them would be dead, and the survivors would face a choice that would haunt American history forever.
In the spring of 1846, a group of American pioneers began their journey west. They were ordinary families, mothers and fathers, young children, newly married couples. They packed their lives into wooden wagons and left Independence, Missouri, chasing a dream that many Americans believed in at the time. A new beginning in California. California was described as a land of opportunity, rich farmland, open skies, freedom, a place where a man could rebuild his life and secure a future for his children. Among the travelers were the Donner family and the Reed family. Together with other settlers, nearly 90 people formed what would later be known as the Donner Party. The journey was expected to take 4 months. It would take far longer, and not everyone would survive. As they moved west along the Oregon Trail, they heard about a new route, a shortcut known as the Hastings Cutoff. It promised to save time. It promised a faster arrival in California before winter. But the shortcut was dangerous. Very few had traveled it successfully. The man who promoted it, Lansford Hastings, had never guided a wagon train through it himself. Still, the idea of saving time was tempting. Every mile mattered. Winter in the mountains could be deadly. The Donner Party made a decision that would change everything. They chose the shortcut. At first, the path seemed manageable, but soon the terrain became harsh and unforgiving. They were forced to carve their own road through thick brush and rocky ground. Wagons broke. Oxen collapsed from exhaustion. Supplies were lost. Time slipped away. Crossing the Great Salt Lake Desert nearly destroyed them. For 6 days they struggled without reliable water. The heat was merciless. Animals died in the sand. Families watched their resources disappear. By the time they emerged from the desert, they were weeks behind schedule. Winter was approaching. In October of 1846, they reached the base of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The peaks were tall and silent, covered in early snow. At first, the snowfall seemed light, even beautiful. Children played in it, laughing, but the adults understood the danger. Then the storm came. Heavy snow fell without mercy. Within days, the mountain passes were buried under deep drifts, 10 feet, then more. The wagons could not move forward. Turning back was impossible. The Donner Party was trapped in the Sierra Nevada. They built crude cabins near a frozen lake, hoping the snow would melt. They rationed their remaining food carefully. Every scrap of meat, every handful of flour, every drop of water mattered. But the snow did not melt. It kept falling. Hunting became nearly impossible. Wildlife disappeared into the mountains. The cold grew sharper. The wind cut through thin wooden walls at night. Slowly, a terrible realization settled over them. They were not delayed, they were stranded, and rescue would not come quickly. Inside those cabins, families huddled together for warmth, unaware that the true horror of winter had only just begun.
Winter tightened its grip around the Sierra Nevada. The snow outside the cabins rose higher each week, sealing the Donner Party inside a frozen prison. The lake beside them turned solid with ice. The forest grew silent. Food became their greatest fear. At first they rationed what little remained, small portions of flour, thin strips of dried meat, a few beans shared between families. Mothers tried to hide their hunger from their children. Fathers pretended everything would be fine. But the supplies were disappearing. The oxen and cattle that had survived the desert were slaughtered one by one. Every animal represented a few more days of life. Nothing was wasted. Bones were boiled, hides were scraped and softened. Even scraps meant survival. When the last of the livestock was gone, reality set in. There would be no more easy meals. Snow continued to fall. Hunting parties attempted to leave the camp, but the drifts were too deep. Some men tried to cross the mountains on foot, hoping to reach help in California. They failed. The snow was too thick, the cold too powerful. Inside the cabins, weakness began to spread. Children cried through the night from hunger. Mothers grew pale and quiet. Arguments broke out over food portions. Trust began to crack. Starvation changes people. It slows the body. It clouds the mind. It turns patience into anger and hope into desperation. Some began boiling strips of animal hide to create a thin, bitter soup. Others crushed bones into powder and mixed it with water. There were days when families survived on nothing more than melted snow. Time lost meaning. Each morning felt the same as the one before: cold, hunger, waiting. A small group finally decided they could not stay any longer. In December, 15 members of the Donner Party attempted a desperate escape over the mountains using makeshift snowshoes. They hoped to reach California and bring back rescue. They left behind their families, promising to return. The journey became known as the Forlorn Hope. Within days, they faced brutal storms and freezing temperatures. Food ran out quickly. One by one, members of the group collapsed from exhaustion. Some never stood again. Back at the cabins, the remaining families waited. They watched the mountains. They listened for any sign of rescue. But nothing came. Inside the cabins, people grew weaker, faces thinned, eyes hollowed. The human body can only survive so long without nourishment. The snow outside reached nearly 20 feet in some places. The Donner Party was completely cut off from the world. And as the weeks passed, a terrifying question began to form in the silence.
What happens when there is truly nothing left to eat? By January of 1847, the Sierra Nevada had become a white graveyard. Inside the cabins near the frozen lake, starvation was no longer a fear of the future. It was the reality of every waking moment. Bodies grew thin, movements slowed, conversations became shorter. People no longer wasted energy speaking unless necessary. The Forlorn Hope group, the 15 who had attempted to cross the mountains, were now fighting their own battle far from the lake. Their supplies had run out. Snowstorms buried their path. The cold pierced through layers of clothing and into bone. One by one, members of the group collapsed. At first, the survivors tried to carry the weak. They tried to share what little strength they had, but starvation does not allow heroism for long. When the first person died, silence followed. No one spoke about the thought that entered their minds, but everyone felt it. They were days away from death themselves. Snow surrounded them, no animals, no plants, no hope of immediate rescue. The decision that followed would mark this tragedy forever. They consumed the bodies of those who had already died. There was no violence among them at that moment, no murder, only desperation, a final, terrible attempt to stay alive. Back at the cabins near Donner Lake, conditions were just as brutal. The remaining families were running out of everything. Hides had been boiled until they dissolved. Bones had been crushed into powder. Even the smallest scraps were gone. People began to die inside the cabins. Children first, then the elderly. Each death made the silence heavier. Those still alive faced the same unbearable reality as the Forlorn Hope group. Survival demanded a choice that no human being ever wants to consider. Some resisted the idea with every ounce of strength they had left. Others stared at the floor, too weak to argue. Hunger strips away pride. It strips away civilization. It reduces life to its most basic instinct: survive. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Storm after storm buried the mountains deeper. Rescue parties in California had heard rumors of a stranded wagon train, but the weather made travel nearly impossible. Weeks passed. The survivors inside the cabins grew quieter. Eyes lost their light. Hope began to fade. The mountains showed no mercy, and the Donner Party was now living through one of the darkest chapters in American pioneer history. By February of 1847, whispers of the stranded wagon train finally reached settlements in California. Rescue parties were organized, but the journey back into the mountains was dangerous. Snow still buried the passes. Storms continued to roll across the Sierra Nevada without warning. The first relief party fought through deep drifts and freezing winds. Every step toward the lake required cutting through walls of snow taller than a man. Progress was slow and exhausting. When they finally reached the campsite near Donner Lake, what they found was beyond anything they had imagined. Cabins half buried in snow. smoke barely rising from crude chimneys. Silence. Inside the first cabin, rescuers saw figures that hardly looked human, faces hollow, eyes sunken deep into pale skin. Survivors were too weak to stand. Some could not even speak. Children clung to strangers with skeletal arms. The rescuers brought small amounts of food, but even that had to be given carefully. Starved bodies cannot handle sudden nourishment. Too much food too quickly can kill. Several survivors were strong enough to leave immediately. They were guided slowly through the mountains toward safety, but many remained behind. Some refused to leave family members who were too weak to travel. Others were physically unable to move. The first rescue party left with only a portion of the survivors. The rest waited once again. Inside the cabins, death had become familiar. Bodies lay wrapped in blankets near walls of packed snow. Some were partially hidden, as if the living had tried not to look at them. The line between grief and numbness had blurred. When the second rescue party arrived weeks later, the conditions were even worse. Food had run out again. Those still alive had grown quieter, almost detached from the world around them. Survival had reduced life to breathing, waiting, enduring. The rescuers understood what had happened during the long winter. They did not ask questions. They did not judge. They focused only on saving whoever they could. More survivors were led out of the mountains. Each step was painful. Frost-bitten feet cracked against frozen ground. Some collapsed during the journey and had to be carried. Back at the lake, a few remained until the final rescue effort in April. By the time the last group was brought out of the Sierra Nevada, nearly half of the original party had died. The snow began to melt as spring approached, slowly revealing the full extent of the tragedy. What had started as a hopeful journey west had turned into a fight against starvation, isolation, and the limits of human endurance. The Donner Party had survived the winter, but survival had come at a cost that would follow them for the rest of their lives. When the survivors finally reached California, they did not arrive as pioneers. They arrived as witnesses to horror. News of the stranded wagon train spread quickly through settlements and newspapers. At first, the story was told as a tale of survival against impossible odds. But as more details emerged, the tone began to change. Whispers turned into headlines. The word cannibalism traveled faster than any wagon ever could. For the survivors, the physical suffering of winter was only the beginning. Many were severely malnourished. Frostbite had claimed fingers and toes. Illness lingered in weakened bodies. But the deeper wounds were invisible. Some survivors refused to speak about what had happened in the mountains. Others tried to explain the desperation, the starvation, the reality of facing death in a frozen wilderness. The public reaction was divided. Many people expressed sympathy. They understood the brutal conditions of frontier life. They knew that the American West was unpredictable and merciless. But others judged harshly. Rumors exaggerated the truth. Stories spread of violence and murder, even when no evidence supported such claims. The tragedy became something sensational, something shocking. For the Donner family and the Reed family, rebuilding life was not simple. George Donner, one of the leaders of the party, did not survive the winter. His wife, Tamsin Donner, refused multiple chances to leave the mountains because she would not abandon her husband. She died near him before the final rescue arrived. James Reed survived and eventually became successful in California, yet even he carried the weight of what had happened. Children who had endured the winter grew up with memories that never fully faded. Some would later describe the endless snow, the hunger, and the silence inside the cabins. They remembered watching adults change. They remembered the moment hope disappeared. For many survivors, guilt lingered. Guilt for living when others had not. Guilt for the choices made in desperation. In private moments, long after the snow had melted, they likely asked themselves the same question over and over. Could anything have been done differently? The shortcut through the Hastings Cutoff was widely blamed. It became a warning told to future wagon trains. Maps were reconsidered. Routes were studied more carefully. The tragedy of the Donner Party became a lesson written in snow and loss. It reminded settlers that ambition must be balanced with caution, that nature does not negotiate, that timing can mean the difference between life and death. Yet despite everything, the story endured not only because of the horror, it endured because some survived. Human beings pushed beyond the limits of hunger, cold, and fear. They walked out of the mountains when many believed no one could. But survival did not erase what they had seen, and it did not silence the memory of that long, unforgiving winter in the Sierra Nevada.
The story of the Donner Party did not end when the snow melted. It became part of American history. In the years that followed, the westward expansion continued. Wagon trains still crossed the plains. Families still chased the promise of California. But the mountains of the Sierra Nevada carried a new reputation. They were no longer just beautiful. They were a warning. Travelers who passed near Donner Lake in later years sometimes spoke of unease. The quiet water, the towering peaks, the knowledge of what had happened there during the winter of 1846. Beneath the snow and soil rested the memory of nearly half a wagon train that never made it through. Historians would later examine every detail: the decision to take the Hastings Cutoff, the delays in the desert, the early arrival of winter. Each factor alone might not have caused disaster, but together they created a perfect storm. The tragedy forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about survival. When stripped of comfort, of law, of society, what remains? The winter in the Sierra Nevada revealed how fragile civilization can be. Hunger does not negotiate. Cold does not care about dreams. Nature does not respond to hope. And yet, within that darkness, there was also resilience. Parents who gave their last strength to their children. Rescuers who climbed into the mountains knowing they might not return. Survivors who walked out of the snow with nothing but the will to keep moving. The Donner Party became more than a story of cannibalism. It became a story about decisions, about timing, about how quickly optimism can turn into desperation. For the children who survived, the memory never truly disappeared. Long after they built new homes and started new lives, winter must have felt different to them. The first snowfall of each year likely carried a shadow, a reminder of cabins buried under 20 feet of snow, a reminder of silence broken only by wind. Today, visitors stand near Donner Lake and see a peaceful landscape. Trees sway gently. The water reflects the sky. It is hard to imagine the suffering that once unfolded there. But history remembers. The names of the families remain recorded. Their journey west still studied. Their winter still discussed in classrooms and books. The Donner Party reminds us that the frontier was not just adventure. It was risk. It was uncertainty. It was survival at the edge of human endurance. In the end, the mountains did not care about their dreams of California. But the world would never forget what happened when those dreams became trapped in the snow.